Okay, so today we're going to talk about the second presentation. Now, I believe y'all are in the class where we didn't talk about the all or none law. So we're going to do that first. That's about neurons, okay? So we're going to do that first, and then we're going to continue to this presentation. So the all or none law refers to the fact that in neurons, when a neuron fires or has an action potential, it does so at full intensity and speed. So the only option a neuron has is to fire or not fire. It's like a light switch, not a dimmer, but just an on-off switch. So like your radio, you turn that on or off, not like the volume, okay? So in other words, a neuron, even if it's having a strong signal or a weaker signal, all it can do is fire. Neurons do not fire at different intensities. They just fire or not. So what then accounts for a stronger or weaker signal? How do we know that a signal is stronger or weaker? The answer is the number of neurons firing. When a signal is stronger, more neurons fire. The reason this happens is because of the different thresholds of sensitivity that a neuron has. So there are some neurons with a very low threshold of sensitivity, and they fire at something very, very small as far as the intensity of that signal. For example, if a fly lands on my head, and then I point to my hand. Yeah, okay. If a fly lands on my hand, then there are some neurons that fire just from that tiny bit of pressure on my skin. Okay? However, other neurons will only fire if, let's say, I slap myself on my hand. So in other words, when I slap myself on the hand, this neurons, let's say they start here, the threshold is up here, right? And that neuron is firing, and of course, if the stimulation got to that level, then it also has reached these levels down here. So the fly lands on my hand, that one fires. And then when I slap my hand, that one fires, and many others in between fire, and this one fires. So what if I cut my hand off? Well, that's way up here. If I got that much stimulation that I need to fire, obviously all of these fire too, right? Because if the level gets here, it surpassed all of these levels. So all of those are firing. So when I have an accident and my arm or my hand gets cut off, the neurons that would fire when a fly lands on there are firing, along with the neurons that would fire if I just slap my hand, along with some neurons that for you and me, they may never fire because they require a depth of pressure and pain way down at my bones, for example, that I may never get to. Hopefully none of us will know that amount of pain, right? So there are some neurons that fire only when the pain is so intense because of intense pressure or intense temperature or something like that. So a neuron's all or none law means that the only thing that any one neuron can do is fire or not fire. When it fires every time at full intensity and full speed, okay? So a message that is stronger than a previous message will have more neurons firing, and they also fire over and over and over again. But every time they fire at full speed and full intensity, okay? So more neurons fire with stronger messages. Got it?
We had a question where it said, what is meant by neurons only firing or not firing? What is this called?
That's the all or none law.
The all or none law. Okay.
Yeah, all or none law, and it means that they either fire or don't fire, and that for a stronger signal, more neurons fire. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the brain and the spinal cord and the nervous system. And remember that this is the presentation called the brain and the spinal cord. So this is the first slide. So right now, it's called brain and the nervous system. That's the name of the presentation. And this first slide is on the central nervous system. And because I didn't make these slides, Dr. Shu, who's now retired, made them for the entire department. I'm not exactly in love with the way, the order of the presentation, so I'm going to start towards the back, okay? So I'm going to go down to the very end of the presentation, and I'm going to go back a few till we get to this slide, about 4 slides in. And this one is called the organization of the nervous system. So the nervous system are all the neurons in the body, right? And the nervous system is divided into 2 main divisions. There's the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which are all the nerves that go from the spinal cord down to the body and from the body up to the spinal cord. So I'm going to go back to the first slide for 1 second to show you something. Okay, so here in the first slide you see in red the brain and the nerve and the spinal cord. They are in red. That's the central nervous system. And then all the nerves that are coming out from the spinal cord to the body and back, all of those are the peripheral nervous system shown here in blue. Okay, so back to our slide towards the end here. All right, so the peripheral nervous system is further divided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic. The somatic nervous system interacts with the external world. And there are 2 main divisions, okay? The one division is the sensory nervous system, and the other is the motor nervous system. So the sensory motor system are all the nerves that come up from the body's senses up to the spinal cord, okay? And the motor nervous system, that's all of the nerves that go from the spinal cord to the muscles and glands in the body, okay? So somatic deals with the external world. The sensory nervous system is a division of that somatic. It brings information from the sense organs. The motor nervous system is also a division of the somatic, and what it does is it takes information down from the spinal cord down to the body to tell the muscles and glands what to do. Okay? So when that fly landed on my hand, there are neurons that are going to fire, and they're going to send a message from my hand all the way up to my spinal cord and eventually to my brain. And my brain might say, shoo that fly off, right? So my brain sends a message down my spinal cord and to my hand to shoo, right, to move so that I shoo the fly off. You with me? All right. Now the next division of the peripheral nervous system is actually more important to us in psychology because it has a lot to do with many things that go on in psychology. So this is called the autonomic nervous system. And I like to have you remember that the autonomic nervous system deals with everything that's automatic. So autonomic, automatic. And the autonomic nervous system regulates internal organs and internal functioning. Okay, so it has 2 divisions, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So when you're in a normal state, like I'm sure all of us in here are right now, the parasympathetic system is on and it's doing everything that a body needs to do. So you're digesting your food, you're fighting off illness, you are repairing your cells, and of course your heart is beating and you're breathing and stuff like that. But when you have a crisis, the sympathetic nervous system comes on. Excuse me. And what it's going to do is it's going to turn off things that are not necessary to survival right now. So it's going to stop your digestion. it's gonna stop fighting off illness and repairing cells. And it's gonna have this reaction called the fight or flight response.
That's sympathetic.
The sympathetic, yeah. The fight or flight response will help you to fight or flee from whatever it is that's happening. So what's gonna happen in this fight or flight response is that you're gonna stop those unessential processes. You're gonna release stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline into the bloodstream. And you're gonna release more oxygen and glucose. And they're gonna be going specifically more to the heart and the lungs and the big muscle groups, okay? So I like to have you remember that the autonomic nervous system deals with everything that's automatic. The sympathetic has sympathy for you in a crisis. It gets you ready to deal with that crisis. And the parasympathetic puts you back together again like a paramedic would, okay? So if you're having a picnic in the woods, this next slide, as you see, is a little more information about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So this is the autonomic nervous system, okay? So you're having a picnic in the woods, and you're fine, and you decide to sit there for a little while, or maybe even take a little walk, and you're digesting your food, and you're fighting off illness, and you're repairing cells. Everything is happening, right? Well, as you walk along casually, you see a bear, and you flip out, right? Because this is scary. Well, what's going to happen is that your sympathetic nervous system is going to turn on. And that sympathetic nervous system is going to cause you to stop digesting your food. It's going to stop fighting off illness and repairing cells. It's going to release those stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, for example. And glucose and oxygen are going to be flowing to the big muscle groups, the heart and the lungs especially, to get them prepared to fight the bear or flee from the bear, the fight or flight response. And once you calm down, the parasympathetic will put you back together again like a paramedic would. It's going to bring everything back to normal. Your heart rate and respiration will return. They'll lower back to normal rates, and then you will start to digest again and fight off illness and so forth. Now this was a very helpful process back when we really had to deal with bears and fight for our food and stuff like that. But now, when we get stressed out, you see this guy, dealing with papers and phone calls and stuff. Well, now when we get stressed out, a lot of times it's not a life or death situation, almost never, right? So, for example, somebody cuts you off on the freeway, and you have to come to a screeching halt, and you get angry because you almost died, right? So you get so scared that it comes out as anger, for me anyway. For some of y'all, maybe actual fear, but I do everything with anger, so whatever. But anyway, so then what are you going to do? Because you can shoot the finger at them, but that's not going to get rid of all this. You're ready. Okay, your body has made you ready to get out of the car, chase them down, and kill them for doing that to you. Your body just got prepped to do this huge physical activity. And what are you going to do, shoot the finger? Well, that's not very energetic. Even if you go, it's still, and really give it to them, double-handed, no hands on the steering wheel, right? It doesn't matter. What you're doing is not enough to get rid of that. So what happens is the body has to deal with all this stress hormone that it just put out, and all this increase in heart rate and stuff, and plus we just put everything that we needed on hold, right? So now I'm not fighting off illness, I'm not digesting my food, I'm not repairing cells because you cut me off on the freeway. And and I can't get rid of that, and it takes longer than to go back to and have my parasympathetic bring me back to normal. And if this happens over and over and over, then we're constantly in a situation where we can't repair ourselves, we're not fighting off illness, and we're dealing with these stress hormones that are bad for us. So that's the problem nowadays, is that we've still got this ancient way of dealing with new problems, right? And the ancient way, this didn't happen every day, but it sure happened when you were about to be somebody's dinner, right? If you saw a tiger, your ass was running, and you needed that. But now, when you feel threatened, it's because your boss yelled at you or something, right? And you don't need that kind of reaction, but you still have it physically. Okay, so let's talk a minute about the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is the glands, okay? And the pituitary gland is the master gland. It releases hormones that affect all the other glands. It's controlled by the hypothalamus, which we're going to talk about today, and it produces growth hormones. The thyroid gland is important in psychology because the thyroid gland, actually, its job is metabolism. And when it's off, people can have some psychological reactions like mood swings and depression. So the thyroid, you can have too much or too little. Hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism. Hypothyroidism is too little, and this makes people overweight, and then it also can make them depressed and so forth. How many of you know anything about my wife? Anybody know anything about my wife? You probably do, right? She was. Okay, so my wife, soon to be ex-wife, is a famous sign language interpreter. She interprets music festivals and concerts and all that. She's been all over the world, and she's interpreted for every artist you can imagine. She's been in every newspaper, magazines, on TV, you name it. Okay, and she has hypothyroidism. So she has this illness, this disease, and they had to remove her thyroid. And so sometimes she'll get down, and I'll be like, did you take it, or if she stays down, I'll be like, maybe you need to go see your doctor and make sure your levels are okay. Because they give a medicine to make up for the lack of hypothyroidism. She's also overweight, which is very common in people with hypothyroidism because they don't have the metabolism that they should. So even if they eat very little, their body is not metabolizing it. Okay, pancreas. I don't have that excuse, so see, there you go, for being overweight. All right, pancreas. The pancreas release insulin, and so they help us process sugar, for example. So you've heard of diabetes, I'm sure. Some people have diabetes from the time they're children because they're born with bad pancreas. But most of us have type 2 diabetes. I'm working on that. You eat too much sugar until you ruin your pancreas. So I'm working on that. I'll have it soon, I'm sure. Adrenal glands are glands that put out epinephrine and norepinephrine, so basically adrenaline, when we have a stress response. Okay? All right, yes.
Thyroid, I don't know if it's related to discuss, the one that makes your eyes pop out?
Yes, that's
Same
hyperthyroidism.
thing as this one?
It is the thyroid, yes, gland, but it's too much instead of too little. So people with hyperthyroidism, they eat and eat and eat, and they're still real thin because their metabolism is just crazy going. And they also their eyes tend to pop out after a while. They not pop out like they're going places, but like they're gonna roll down the hall, but their eyes seem to be a little more protruded than is typical of most
No, I see
people.
people that looks like it's coming out.
Right, like, hey, let me help you with that.
That's crazy.
Let me help you with that. Poke that eye back in. Yes, there are some people who just have that for other reasons, but still, yeah. Usually they've had it a while by the time their eyes get that way. All right, so let's go back here to the beginning of the presentation. And now we're going to talk about the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, right? So the spinal cord actually controls some things on its own. For example, if you touch something hot, it doesn't have the body, the spinal cord will actually have a reflex to pull that away, right? Because you don't want to have to go like, I touched something hot and it's going up my sensory neurons, and then it's going to go to my brain, and my brain's going to be like, yo, hey, you touch something hot, it's going to burn the hell out of you. You better move your hand. And then it goes down my spinal cord and down my arm to move my hand, right? So a quicker way is just the minute that heat gets to the spinal cord, that hand comes back, okay? Just boom, it's just automatic. You can't even help it. The spinal cord also has all the peripheral nerves that go into it, and of course, the further down on your body, the further down they come in the spinal cord. So if you hurt yourself here, you might not be able to move from the waist down. If you hurt yourself here, you can't move from the neck down. If you here, it'd be just the shoulders down, and so forth, okay? All right, so this is the brain. We're gonna talk about it. 100 billion neurons and 1 trillion glial cells. That's a lot. Okay, so if you look over here on the board, I've divided, first of all, before I even get there, when you're dealing with things that we're gonna talk about here in the brain, I want you to make sure you know the difference between a brain structure, a brain system, a brain lobe, and a brain hemisphere. This will help you answer questions on the exams. When it asks for a brain structure, it's going to be one of these structures I'm about to talk about. If they ask you for a brain system, we're only talking about 2 of them. They're also on here, and we'll talk about them today. Then there are the brain hemispheres, which means the 2 sides, the right and the left sides of the brain. And then the brain lobes, there are 4, and we actually probably won't get to those until next time, okay? But let's go with this. So in the brain structures, you can very rudimentarily divide the brain into 3 basic parts. In other words, very simply, very roughly, okay? And the first part is the hindbrain, which is more commonly now called the brain stem. This is, evolutionarily speaking, the oldest part of the brain. It's been around for a while, okay? And in the brain stem, we have 3 parts that we're going to talk about: the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. So the medulla is here, right above the spinal cord, and the medulla is very important. It controls breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure, so it keeps you alive. And you have heard on Waterboy, how many of you saw Waterboy? That movie?
Medulla oblongata.
The medulla oblongata, right? And they call it oblongata because they're referring to, that means it's oblong. And as you can see, it's like an oval, right? An oblong shape. So that's the medulla oblongata, okay? Breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. The pons is right above it, and the pons sends messages that it got from the spinal cord up to the cerebellum, which we'll talk about in a moment, and also up here to the motor cortex, which we'll probably talk about next time. And then the other part of the brainstem that's important is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is that little cauliflower-looking thing at the back of the brain there, and the cerebellum deals with coordinated, skilled movement. But it also allows the body to maintain balance and posture and muscle tone. So the 2 that I really need you to know from the brainstem or hindbrain are the medulla and the cerebellum. All right, so then we're not even going to talk about the brainstem. Let's move to the forebrain. So the forebrain are things that are a little bit more advanced. And in the forebrain, we have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the cerebrum and cerebral cortex. So the thalamus is a sensory relay station. It brings information from the lower brain centers up to the sensation part, which is here. So it brings it from, it basically takes stuff from here, from the sensory neurons coming up the spinal cord, up through the thalamus and up to here, which is a sensory motor cortex that we'll talk about tomorrow. Not real important for me that you know that part, but really important is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is this tiny little part right in the middle of the brain. And this little part here, by the way, is the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus controls that gland. So the hypothalamus controls our drives: hunger, thirst, sex drive. It also controls our body temperature, and it regulates the pituitary and is involved in emotion as well. Now, there's some interesting things we found about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has a particular lobe, which means a little area on it that is usually bigger in men than in women. And what we found is that gay men tend to have smaller lobes in that hypothalamus than do straight men, so that their lobe of the hypothalamus is more likely to be similar to a woman's. So next unit, in unit 4, we're gonna talk all about LGBT stuff. And if you're still thinking that people choose to be gay or something like that, you need to welcome yourself into 2019, okay? And we'll talk about that next unit. Okay, so the next part that we're gonna talk about is the cerebrum, and also the outer layers of the cerebrum, which are called the cerebral cortex. So the cerebrum is most of the brain part here that you see in yellow, and the outer eighth of an inch, all along that cerebrum, that outer eighth of an inch is called the cerebral cortex. And this is where we are definitely able to do those things that are most uniquely human, okay? So we have all of the stuff that we do there that is uniquely human. I'm making sure that thing's on, sorry. Okay, so these are brain structures, okay? Now, we're gonna talk now about 2 brain systems. What's the difference between a structure and a system? I can go in and dissect the structure. I can take that little part out of the brain and show you, here's the hypothalamus, right, okay? Here's the pons, here's the medulla. But these are brain systems. So going back to this one, the reticular formation is the first one we're gonna talk about. This is a brain system. A system are a group of neurons that flow throughout various structures together, and they all work together to perform certain abilities and so forth. So the reticular formation is also called the reticular activating system, so RAS. So you might hear it both ways. And this system affects our arousal, or controls our arousal and our attention. So for example, if something came through the window right now, busted the window and landed in the room, I'm sure all of us would turn around and go, what? Okay, and what we're doing is our reticular formation has decided, pay attention to that. That seems to be important, okay? So the other thing that this does is it functions in our sleep. It allows us, for example, to not act out our dreams by paralyzing us while we're sleeping. And then it also determines what should wake us up when we're sleeping and what shouldn't. So for example, we might sleep through the radio or the television, but not through the phone ringing or our doorbell ringing, right? So we wake up for certain things and not others because our reticular formation tells us to wake up or not. So most of the time, it tells us to wake up when we hear our alarm. Occasionally, it goes, I don't think so, and we don't wake up when we hear our alarm, as we should, right? Okay, so an interesting thing about this is they've done studies on women in homeless shelters that have infants. So when you're in a homeless shelter with an infant, usually it's just one big room and you have a bunch of beds for the women and a bunch of cribs for the infants. And when women first check into these homeless shelters with their infants, they have a hard time sleeping at night because they wake up at every baby crying. And then soon they will learn, however, their system learns, their reticular formation allows them to sleep through the cries of the other babies and wake up only when their own baby cries. So it's trainable, okay? All right, so those are the 2 systems. Now let's talk about the brain. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you about the second system. No, just let me get away with it too. The limbic system is the second system. Remember, a system is a group of neurons that travel together throughout various structures and all work together to perform certain tasks. This is the limbic system. In and of itself, it's a primitive brain. The limbic system includes the amygdala, which is important to emotional expression and especially fear, and the hippocampus, which is especially important to making new memories. So the limbic system controls emotional expression, memory, and motivation. And interestingly enough, as you probably know, things that are more emotional, things that are happy or upsetting, are easier to remember, right? Oftentimes we think it's because this hippocampus is connected to the amygdala. So those are the two systems.
Do women have a larger limbic system than men do?
Not that I know of. We're gonna skip the lobes, and we're gonna talk about the brain hemispheres. Let me go to this one right here. Okay, so we have two sides of the brain, the right side and the left side. It's our own right and left, okay? So my right side, your right side is your right brain, your left side is your left brain, okay? And these two sides of the brain, they actually have different functions, okay? Now, these fibers that you see here connecting the two hemispheres, these are called the corpus callosum. And whatever axon, you have an axon that connects each neuron here to the other side, okay? So they connect each other, with each other on either side. And each side of the brain has its own specialty. So each hemisphere has its own specialty. Now, before we get to that, let's talk about how things go to the hemispheres. So at the base of the spinal cord, all of the neurons that come from the right side of my body, at the base of the spinal cord, will cross over and they will go up to the left side of my brain. So my motor neurons will cross over to the left side of my brain. And the left side of my brain, I'm sorry, those were sensory neurons. I apologize. Okay, let me do that again. So everything on the right, all of the sensory neurons on the right side of my body will cross over and be dealt with by the left side of my brain, okay? And then all of the motor neurons will be on the right side of my body, will be controlled by the left side of my brain. So the left side of my brain is going to receive information from the right side and control the right side. And the same is true of the right side of my brain. It receives information from the left side of my body and it controls the right side of my body. And that's true for almost everything except one of the noted differences is your smell. Olfaction is a very old sense, and it's dealt with very, very far down in the brain. So as far as I've read different things, but as far as I know, everything that goes into your right nostril goes into your right brain, and left goes directly to left. Okay? Now, that's not important. What is important is vision. So now I'm going to tell you how we the brain deals with vision. Okay, so it's not everything in this eye goes to that brain and everything in this eye goes to the other. That's not how it works, okay? So the first thing I want to introduce you to is the concept of a visual field. If you cover one eye, what you can see with the other eye, I can see there all the way to right there, here. This is the visual field for my eye, for that eye, okay? And then this is the visual field for this eye, right? So what happens is, if we imaginarily divide those visual fields into right and left, the right side of what I see with one eye and the right side of what I see with the other will go to the left side of my brain. And the left side of what I see with both eyes goes to the right side of my brain. So let's look at these pictures I drew up here. Here's the visual field for your right eye. The right side of what you see with your right eye is going to be covered by the left side of your brain. And the left side of what you see with that eye goes to the right side of your brain. So what crosses over are the sides of the visual field. Okay, so you have the right and left side of each eye go to the opposite side of the brain. So So another way to look at this is like this. The right side of what I see with my right eye and the right side of what I see with my left eye go to the left side of the brain. So this is the right side and the right side, they go to the left, right? And the left side and the left side of what I see, both eyes, goes to the right. So the right side of what I see with both eyes goes to the left side of the brain. The left side of what I see with both eyes goes to the right side of my brain. You with me? Okay. So if I hurt myself in, let's go back at this one. This is my occipital lobe back here. As we'll talk about next time, this is the lobe that deals with vision. If I hurt myself in my left occipital lobe, which eye will be affected? Both eyes. Good for you that you didn't fall for that trick. Okay? My last class went down hard. Okay, so the occipital lobe, you hurt yourself on the left side of your occipital lobe, it's going to affect the right side of what you see with both eyes. Does that make sense? Yes? Everybody good? All right. Okay, so that's the eyeballs. Now, let's talk about these different functions that we usually put on different sides of the brain. This is called lateralization, and you need to know that. It's not in anywhere, but you do need to know it. So please write it down. Lateralization. Lateralization means that we keep some functions on one side of the brain and other functions on another. So this is called lateralization. Okay, so most people are left brain dominant. For most people, the left side of their brain is dominant, okay? And for most people, the left side of their brain deals with language and logic. I like to have you remember left, language, logic, leader. Leader meaning it's usually dominant. Left, language, logic, leader. Okay? The right side of the brain deals with things that are non-verbal. So spatial stuff, like imagining something three-dimensionally. Music, art, sports, things that are not related to language. So remember that the right hemisphere gets information from the left side of the body, okay, sends information to the left side of the body, and usually controls things like that are nonverbal, right? It also tends to be more creative and intuitive. So non-verbal stuff, non-analytical stuff, music, art, sports, stuff like that. The left side of the brain gets information from the right side of the body and sends motor information to the right side of the body. It usually controls things like language and logic. It's very analytical, math and science type stuff. Okay? So let's talk about some of these, or not talk about, but let's do a few things to kind of show you something about what I'm telling you.
So the left side of the brain gets information from the right side of the body, right? Is that what you said?
Okay. We're going to do an exercise right now, so please participate. All right, put out your right arm and make little circles with your right arm like this. Okay, put out your left leg. So you're going to the right with your arm, and now with your leg, I want you to go to the left. Left with your leg, right with your arm. okay? All right, stop that. That wasn't too bad, right? But now I want you to put out the same side. So right arm and right leg, or left arm and left leg. Put out the same side. Try to go, you're going the same direction. Try to go opposite directions. Right with your arm and left with your leg. If it feels easy, it's because you're doing it wrong. Same side of your body. So put out your other arm. And that same leg. Right with your arm, left with your leg. Okay? That's way harder, right?
Yeah, a lot.
Okay, so here's the deal. When I'm going like this, I'm telling the left side of my brain to move my right arm right. And I'm telling the right side of my brain to move my left leg. So I'm telling two different sides to do different things. But when I go like this and I use the same side, right arm, right leg, now I'm telling the left side, go right, go left, go right, go left. And it gets a lot harder, although it gets easier with practice.
It's like walking, like you can't walk like this, you walk.
I don't know.
Maybe.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at where are you right or left brain dominant. Now, short of brain surgery, which I only do during office hours, we can't really know which side is dominant for you. But we have ways of kind of guessing. Okay? The first thing we're going to do is I'm gonna have you get everything out of your hands, okay? So keep your hands clear because we're gonna use your hands here in a minute. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tell you to do something, and just don't think about it, just do it, okay? And then as soon as you do it, freeze, so I can see what you did, okay? All right, if you have glasses, you may wanna take them off. So I'm gonna have you slap yourself, just kidding. If you take your glasses, it'll help, I promise, okay? All right, you ready? Take a telescope and put it to your eye. Go ahead, just do it, quick. Put a telescope to your eye. Okay, now freeze, okay? Freeze. However you first put them in there. Are you using binoculars? Both of you are using binoculars. Do a telescope real quick. Telescope means one eye. Okay, you're using your left eyes. All right, you're using your left eye and your left hand. Are you either one of you left-handed?
No.
No? Weird. Okay, right eye, right. Did you do your left hand too?
No.
Did you go to your left eye?
Okay.
Are you left-handed? Okay, so she's left-handed. She did her left hand, went to her left eye, okay, which is more common in left-handers. Okay, which one did you do?
Well, I thought about doing it because you told us, but my right eye is like weaker than my left
Okay.
eye, so I went for my left eye.
Right, a lot of times when that happens, it's because you have a weaker eye. What are you doing?
I did both, but.
You're doing a binoculars.
Yeah.
Pretend you have a telescope and do it real fast. Okay, right arm, right hand, right arm. Are you left-handed?
No.
No? But you used your left hand and you went to your left eye. Is there anything weird about your right eye?
My right eye? No.
No, it works just as well as the left, right? Okay, you're odd. You're left-handed.
I'm not.
Okay, you're not, you're right-handed. But you used your left hand, you went to your left eye.
Yeah, I do everything with my left hand. But I get that from boxing.
Okay,
When you box, you use the left hand first.
okay,
If you're right-handed.
gotcha. I'll learn that. Save the best for last, right? Here's my left, but wait till you feel my right. Okay, let me see y'all again. Right, where did you
Mine was
go?
left, but I have astigmatism, so the left side is stronger.
Okay, so the left side's better. Which hand did you use?
The left.
The left, are you left-handed or right-handed?
Right hand.
Weird, okay. All right, right guys? Okay, right hand, right eye, right hand, right eye, right hand, right eye. Yeah,
Right hand, left eye?
are you left-handed? No.
Nothing weird with my eyes.
Nothing weird with your eyes. You went right, okay. All right, so here's what happens. We tend to favor a hand, right? Most of us favor our right or our left hand. We also tend to favor an eye. So for me, I favor my right eye and I go like this, right? Some of us are maybe right-handed, so we tend to use our right hand, but then we favor our left eye for some reason. Sometimes we have a reason, sometimes we don't. Now, if you're left-handed, you're more likely to use your left hand and also go for that eye. So this one is not very telling, okay, as far as where you right or left brain dominant. But the next one is much more likely to tell you if you're right or left brain dominant. So here's what we're gonna do, okay? Now you gotta promise me you're gonna keep both eyes open the whole time I'm talking until I tell you not to. It's gonna be hard, okay? If you're like, what? Yes. Keep both eyes open, okay? All right, so I'm gonna stretch my arm out in front of me, and I'm gonna bend it at the wrist, and I'm gonna have an index finger pointing to the ceiling. And then I'm gonna pick a line, like this line, or that line, or the chalkboard, the end of the chalkboard, or the window sills, or the door jambs, right? Pick a line. And then what I want you to do is I want you to align your finger with that line, but with both eyes open, okay? Keep both eyes open. Okay, go ahead and do that now. Trust me, you want to do it, because if you don't do it now, you're going to ask me a question later, okay? So everybody do it.
Oh crap,
It's cross-eyed.
that's crazy.
Why are you closing your eyes? Didn't I tell you to keep your eyes open? You little shits. Okay. All right, open. You got both eyes open? All right, now I want you to close your left eye. Did it jump for anybody?
Yes.
It jumped when you closed your left eye?
Yes.
Wow, okay. So if it jumped that first time, then what's happening is you're probably using your left eye more, okay? Which means you may be right brain dominant. All right, now, unless you have a problem with your right eye. Okay, now, both eyes open, make sure it's still aligned. Do it anyway, even if it jumped the first time. Okay, now close your right eye. Did it jump?
Yeah.
Okay, so for most of you, it jumped. Okay.
Nope.
At all? Keep both eyes open again. Close your left eye. Did it jump?
Yes.
Open both eyes.
No.
Open both eyes. Close your right eye. Now it jumped for most of you. Okay, if it jumped the second time, hold on. If it jumped the second time, you're probably left brain dominant, which is what most people are. That means that you use your right eye more. You're focused in on what the right eye is telling you more, okay? And you're usually left brain dominant. If it jumped the first time, then you may very well be right brain dominant because you were using your left eye more, okay? So if you're left-handed and it jumped the first time, that gives us even one more clue that you might be right brain dominant, okay? Now if you have a problem with one of your eyes, this is gonna mess that up, okay? Now if it jumped twice, hold on a minute, if it jumped both times, that's what's being called bilateral. You're bilateral. You go home and tell your parents you're bi. See how that goes. Just check it out and see. Okay. All right. So if you're bilateral, it means you're using both eyes more than most people. Okay? So if you're using both eyes to get the right picture of what you're seeing, that's even better. You know, we always have two different views, right, from each eye. Camera 1, camera 2, literally. Okay? So you see something from this angle, if you close it, it's a little different angle. And that's what allows us to see three-dimensional, right? The fact that we get one picture and then another picture, and it shows us, oh, that's three-dimensional. So when you're bilateral, you're using both eyes more, and you're also likely to not be as traditionally right or left brain dominant. Okay, so if you are right hand dominant, right hand writing, so forth, the left side of your brain is dominant like 97 to 98% of the time. So for almost everybody who's right-handed, their left brain is dominant. Both of those things are typical. Most people are right-handed, most people are left brain dominant, okay? But for left-handers, still 70% of the time, if you're left-handed, you're still left brain dominant. So even if you're atypical in how you write or how you eat and so forth, most of the time you're still typical in your brain. But about 30% of left-handers are right brain dominant. Okay? All right, so we've dealt with that. Any questions? Okay.
That could be thrown off if you're like, someone that's like, works with guns a lot, we tend to have to favor one arm.
Yes, it gets thrown off by all kinds of stuff. Like I said, in short of brain surgery, I ain't gonna figure it out, okay? All right, so, I don't need you to know anything about split brain studies for my class. But I do want to mention some things so that you understand what it's about. I will be so excited if you know how things normally cross over for most people, okay, and how the eyes are dealt with. So excited, in fact, that I don't want you to worry yourself about the abnormal or atypical split-brained patient, okay? So let me tell you what happened. This is Roger Sperry. He won the Nobel Prize in the early 80s for his work in the 60s with patients who had epilepsy or seizures. Do you know what that is?
Yes.
Okay, so a seizure is an electrical brainstorm. Okay, it's a brainstorm. And what happens in a seizure is that something will start firing, neurons will start firing when there's not a reason for them to fire. Okay? So you've heard that people that have seizures might start seeing some lights, right? Or they smell something that's not there, like oranges or coffee or something like that, right? And the reason they do this is because in the brain that something will start to fire. Okay, so this is the area of the brain that deals with vision. Now, a person who's having a seizure, they might start to have some firing here that's not related to actually seeing anything. So they're seeing lights, but the lights aren't there. And what happens is that electrical activity storms. It goes on and on. It makes everything fire. And it will go across the corpus callosum to include the whole brain. When it does that, it becomes much more serious because seizures that last a long time can kill you, okay? So what they've done with what Sperry did is he had patients in the 60s who were having serious seizures. There are people who have hundreds of seizures a day. And some seizures are very minor and you don't even know someone's having them until like they have to figure out, some doctor has to figure out that they have these moments where you're like, hello, where have you been? I've been talking to you. And the person was actually having this mild seizure, okay? All the way up to the seizures that make us contract, right? And shake. And usually it can be one side of the body, I should say, or both sides of the body. So Perry's got some patients who were having very severe seizures and were not showing any kind of improvement with medication, not enough improvement. So he asked them if they would let him cut their corpus callosum in half, just cut it open, so that one side of the brain was not communicating with the other side. And the patients agreed to this because of the severity of their seizures, knowing that this would allow the seizure to stay on one side and would probably be less, not as long and certainly less severe. So he did this, and then he did some research on how these people that had a split brain, how they saw things and processed things differently than people who are not split brain, or majority of us, right? And you can read about that in the book, but I'm not going to have you know anything more except that. Now, sometimes when you take medications or whatever, it tells you don't drink, right? And you're like, well, hell with that. I'm drinking anyway. I know you. I know who you are. Okay, so here's what happens. Our seizure thresholds can be lowered by certain things. And we all have a threshold at which we might have a seizure. And certain medicines lower that threshold. Alcohol lowers the threshold. So these medicines, they're saying, hey, this medicine already lowers your seizure threshold. If you drink, that further lowers it, right? So the lower it goes, the more likely you are to have a seizure. And of course, some people will react to things like bright lights and things like that by having a seizure. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about are these methods of studying the brain. So the first one of these is called an EEG. And in an EEG, they take electrodes and they place them on your brain, and they find out what your brain electrical waves are doing.
Can you repeat that again, please?
The EEG, they place electrodes on your head, and they look at electrical brain activity. So the brain electrical activity is different. They have different patterns of waves when we're awake and alert versus when we're awake but very relaxed and zoning out versus when we're asleep and when we're in different patterns of sleep. A CT scan is also called a CAT scan, and this uses X-rays to take cross-sectional images of the brain. So it takes the images in cross-section from the top like this, or across like that. It looks at what's going on. So, but MRI is a test that uses magnets to look at the structures on the brain, and it's much more high resolution pictures than the CT scan. But all of these have their own use. So for example, you might ask, well, why not always do an MRI? Sometimes the actual information that we need can be handled by the CT scan, or a CT scan might find certain things that an MRI might have a harder time looking for, like hemorrhages, for example. Okay, a PET scan looks for brain activity by injecting the person with a radioactive dye and then following that dye in their brain to see which parts of the brain are active. And they know they're active because that means this radioactive dye is following where the brain metabolism is. So they see that that's where the brain is using oxygen and glucose, or metabolizing things. And so this tells us what activity is going on in the brain, where the activity is, from minute to minute. And then there's an fMRI. The fMRI looks at the brain structures and also the functioning of the brain by using magnets. And it knows which parts of the brain are active and which are not, because the magnetic pull of these cells is different when the cell is oxygenated than when it is not. You don't need to know that, that's just me telling you so. Okay? But the activity of the brain that it can measure is from 1 second to the next, rather than from 1 minute to the next. So once again, you might say, well, why would we do a PET scan if we can do an MRI? Well, sometimes in certain kinds of tumors, for example, we want to see metabolic activity because those tumors are very metabolically active. And so a PET scan would give us more information on those tumors, for example, than an MRI. So there's all kinds of reasons why we might use one or the other. Now I will tell you that I've asked you a couple of questions on the test and stuff about which one of these measures brain activity, and the real answer should be EEG, PET scan, and fMRI, but I kind of left EEG out of there. So really, if you think activity, brain activity, if you think of the PET scan and the fMRI, you're good. Okay, so the brain has the ability to reorganize itself and compensate for brain damage. And this is especially true in children, but also in adults. But children are better able to do that simply because they haven't developed their brain completely. But this is called plasticity, which is sometimes also called neuroplasticity. And it's the brain's ability to reorganize itself and compensate for brain damage. Now, you may have heard that we use 3% of our brain or 20% of our brain or something like that. That's ridiculous. We use 100% of our brain, okay? Anybody who tells you otherwise, ask them which 80% they'd like to hand over, okay? So, absolutely not. We use 100% of our brain. When people say we use 20% or 3% or whatever, what they're saying is that we have the capacity to do so much more with our brain, right? That we can have so much more information in there and so much more connections and so forth. Not that we don't use it. It's like you got a certain amount of clothes, right? And you got to put them in a closet. And if the closet's really big or you don't have that much clothes, you can spread them out all pretty, right? And then if you get more clothes or your closet's really small, you got to cram them in there any way you can, okay? So you're getting all the information in there, but sometimes it's more crowded. So what makes a brain smart? One thing that people think might make a brain smart is the size of the brain. That's absolutely not true. Okay, the size of your brain doesn't make you smarter or not, or otherwise, whales and elephants would be running, Apple or something, right? So they're not. We are, and the reason is because of brain connections. That's what makes us smart. You look at one person versus another person. Who's smarter? Who has more information in their brain? The person who has more synapses, more connections. As you're sitting here today, you're making connections. Everything that you do, you're constantly making new brain synapses. Your dendrites grow and make new synapses in a process that we'll talk about next unit. It's called consolidation. And the dendrites actually grow to physically make a new synapse where that's a new memory. So we keep making new memories, okay, that way. And that's what the complexity of that is what makes our brain smart. So I forgot to tell you about this. Let's talk about a polygraph. I should have talked about this when I was talking about the peripheral nervous system, but a polygraph is a lie detector test. Now, as you might imagine, we can't really tell whether you're lying or not, right? What we do is we assume that if you're lying, you're going to get upset. Now, the best liars, right, are the ones I've been married to and stuff. Just kidding. I've never been married to a liar. I've dated a lot of liars, but I knew better than to get married to them. Okay, so the best liars can lie and not show any upset, right? Okay, so a polygraph, what it does is they connect you to certain machines that are going to measure your physical reactions. So heart rate, blood pressure, respiration rate, and something called your galvanic skin response, which you've heard of people saying they got sweaty hands when they're nervous, right? When we get nervous, we really do get a little bit more moisture in our hands. So they wrap you up in this thing to measure that. And what we find is that when people are upset, then those things go up. Heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, respiration goes up, and so does galvanic skin response. And what we're doing then is we're connecting people to these machines, and we're going to ask them questions. We're going to take a baseline. What's your name? What's your address? Where do you work? How old are you? When's your birthday? And then we're going to ask them, to tell us, did you kill, John Doe? And if they say yes or no, it doesn't matter. What matters is what happens to their galvanic skin response, okay? To their galvanic skin response and all of those physical traits that we're measuring. So what we do is we assume that if those went up, it's because you're lying. But lots of times that's wrong. Because some people can lie, know they're lying, and it doesn't make them physically altered in any way. It doesn't arouse them physically. And other people are telling the truth, and they're a hot mess, and they're sweating and all this stuff, and even though they're telling the truth. So this is why they don't use these in courts, because they're not reliable. We can't be sure that what we have is real, that you didn't lie and it said you weren't lying, or you weren't lying and it said you did, or vice versa. I think I just repeated the same thing. But anyway, you know what I'm saying, that it misjudges you. You got it? Okay. So next time we're gonna pick up on the lobes of the brain. And then after we do that, we're going to go over the page called Learning Objectives, right? In other words, preparing for the Unit 2 test. And then we're gonna play a game that will review us. And then if we have time, which I don't think we will, we'll move on to the next chapter, which is chapter 17 on stress, okay? So